The November wind swept through Pittsburgh's Hill District, like shards of shattered glass, carrying with it the scent of soaked concrete and the cold whisper of an early winter's arrival. As Claire Whitman pulled her worn coat tighter around herself, while carefully wiping down the last table at Edna's diner, the rain-slick sidewalk outside glimmering beneath flickering streetlights and casting trembling reflections across the puddled surface. The world beyond, silent, distant, and indifferent, while inside the small diner, even in the loneliest moments, there still lingered the muted sounds of memory and the steady pulse of ordinary life. And Claire did not yet know it, but on this very night, a stranger hidden in the darkness would force her into a decision that could save a human life or quietly destroy her own. And after sliding the bolt into place and gathering trash from the tables, she let out a weary breath and stepped out the back as the biting wind struck her face head-on, cold seeping through every layer of fabric, and she had no plans for the evening beyond returning home to warm the remaining soup in the pot and surrender to sleep before the clock struck 12. For Pittsburgh in these days was not made for the fragile, and Claire had learned to endure with hardness, wrapped gently in soft restraint. She was not wealthy. No one waited for her at home, and her life had never ventured beyond this crumbling neighborhood. Yet within her, she still preserved something fragile and intact, a faint and stubborn faith in human kindness, and she moved quietly toward the dumpster behind the building, the heavy nylon bag straining in her hand, when from the darkness between the cold metal trash bins, something stirred, and Claire halted, her eyes narrowing to see more clearly. A figure appeared, huddled and ragged with their back against the wall and their face hidden beneath a rain-soaked hood, and for a brief instant the entire world seemed to stop. Not out of fear, but because she knew that feeling all too well, the feeling of being forgotten by the world, folded into the corner of a rainy winter night where no one bothers to look. And the person lifted their head, and their eyes met. And Claire shuddered not from the cold but from the quiet warning of instinct that whispered this was no ordinary homeless stranger. And in that moment, amid the stench of spoiled food, the smear of dried blood, and the soft drip of rain against the tin roof, a silent question took shape in her mind. Had fate just knocked upon her door at the very moment she was preparing to close an ordinary day? In that frozen moment, when a human soul stands at the fragile edge of choice. If you can feel the quiet heartbeat of this story, take a single second to subscribe to our channel as gently as Claire chose not to turn her back on that rainy night. Do not forget to like and share, so that stories like this may continue to travel outward each day. And if you are listening from some distant street corner anywhere in the world, leave us a comment to tell us where you are, so we may know from how far away these small emotions have reached your heart. Claire stood motionless for several seconds, her eyes never leaving the strange man curled among the garbage bags as the light spilling from the diner's back door reached only far enough to reveal the rough beard shadowing his jaw and a dark, blood-stained patch on the shoulder of his coat, the rain still falling in thin, scattered drops while each of his breaths escaped as a faint, trembling groan as though on the verge of fading out. And Claire swallowed hard, her hand tightening around the handle of the trash bag, her thoughts tangled between the instinct to survive and the quiet pull of compassion as she stepped back once, then again, cold sweat spreading across her palms since no one was there to stop her from closing the door, calling the police, or simply pretending she had seen nothing at all. Yet the man's eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, stirred something within her she could not turn away from, and he said nothing, neither pleading nor complaining, as if long accustomed to a world that never reached out to him. And Claire drew a slow breath, set the trash bag aside, and moved toward him with cautious, measured steps. And as she drew nearer, she saw more clearly his pallid face, the tension of pain carved into his brow, and the thin trail of blood running from his upper arm down to his sleeve. And she crouched beside him and asked softly if he could stand. And he gave a small nod, his lips moving in a soundless reply, and she took hold of his uninjured arm, startled by the full weight that leaned into her, and with strained effort she guided him along the narrow passage beside the diner to the old storage shed where she kept tools and odds and ends, the space cramped and smelling of damp wood and faded paint but shielded from the wind. And she settled him gently against a stack of cardboard boxes before slipping back inside to fetch a clean cloth, antiseptic, and a bottle of water. And when she returned, he had drifted into a shallow sleep, his head tilted slightly, wet hair clinging to his forehead, and Claire carefully cut away the fabric around the wound, frowning at the sight of a long but shallow gash that looked as though it had been torn by something sharp, perhaps a sliver of metal or a small blade, and she wiped away the blood, cleansed the injury, and wrapped his arm with practiced hands. the reflex of someone long accustomed to tending her own wounds when no one else was there. And as she finished, he opened his eyes and whispered in a rough, broken voice, a quiet word of thanks, and Claire did not answer, only studied him for a moment before rising to adjust the thin blanket she had found in the corner. And as she turned to leave, she paused and asked his name, and after a brief hesitation he answered in a voice as light as a breath lost in cold air. "Jack," and Claire nodded without further questions, switched off the light, leaving only the faint glow from the narrow crack of the door, and walked away carrying within her a strange sensation, as though something unseen had just shifted, silently and beyond recall. And Claire returned to the storage room near midnight with a cup of hot tea and a slice of toast spread with peanut butter, the only food left in the diner after a long day, setting them on the old wooden table before sitting across from Jack, who now appeared more conscious, though still pale and quiet, as the dim bulb cast their elongated shadows against the wall, and the stillness grew so complete that only the steady patter of rain outside could be heard. And Claire folded her arms and studied him as though weighing an unfamiliar riddle, his weariness evident yet his gaze alert, deep, and guarded, and she spoke in a tone gentle but firm, asking who he was and why he had been wounded enough to collapse behind her diner among the trash. And Jack kept his eyes lowered, fingers tracing the rim of the paper cup as he murmured that he was not a criminal, if that was what she believed. And Claire tilted her head and lowered her voice, replying that it was difficult to know what to believe when she found a bleeding man beside her dumpster, without papers, without reason, and without a single explanation. And Jack released a long breath as if measuring how much trust he could afford to give, saying only that he had run into trouble and was hiding from something he was not meant to see, that he had not come looking for her and needed only a place to stay until morning. And Claire narrowed her eyes, asking if he expected her to help him run, and he shook his head faintly and answered no, that he asked only for one night, no more, swearing he had not brought trouble with him. And she studied him for a long moment, feeling a quiet conflict within herself because Jack did not resemble the wandering vagrants she had known, and in his manner of speech, his eyes, even his restraint, there was the mark of a man who had lived deeply and was hiding far more than he revealed. And Claire did not fully trust him, but sensed no immediate danger either. And she rose and moved to the door with her hand on the light switch and asked if he smoked. And Jack looked up, faintly surprised, and said he had quit long ago. And she nodded and told him there was a space heater in the corner, and that she would leave extra blankets and some food for the morning, but that he could stay only for tonight and must leave by dawn. And Jack inclined his head once more in quiet thanks. And when Claire stepped out, she did not close the door completely but left it open a narrow slit, unsure what she hoped for, yet knowing clearly in her heart that this man carried a heavy sorrow, as though he had lost something immense, and was struggling to preserve the last fragments of himself. And though she did not entirely believe him, she felt that in the bitter cold of winter, a single trace of conscience in another human being was enough for her to risk believing once more. The following morning, the sky lay gray and heavy like an old blanket pulled across the entire neighborhood, the rain having stopped but the air still damp and thick with cold moisture. As Claire arrived at the diner earlier than usual, carrying a small bag of food and a thermos of hot coffee, and instead of heading straight to the kitchen as she did every day, she turned toward the storage room out back. And when she opened the door, she found Jack still asleep, curled beneath the thin blanket with his breathing slow and steady, part of her easing with quiet relief, while another part felt its unease deepen. And she set the bag beside him and slipped away without waking him. And throughout that morning, Claire worked with a restless agitation that pricked beneath her skin like fine needles, as she kept her expression neutral, exchanged a few words with familiar customers, cooked eggs, and poured coffee as she always had. Yet her thoughts kept drifting back to the small storage room and the mysterious man sheltering inside it, and she could not silence the question of whether she had just made a grave mistake, whether she truly knew whom she was helping, and what had driven her to abandon every layer of caution she had so carefully built over the years. And it was not compassion alone. There was something in Jack's eyes, in the way he neither begged nor tried to provoke pity, that reflected her own past back at her, like the night she once sat alone at a train platform with both hands tightly wrapped around an old backpack, waiting for something to change without daring to speak it aloud. For she had been 23 then, leaving a shared apartment after discovering that the man she loved had lied to her for an entire year. The promises of a peaceful future, merely a thin coat of paint, concealing his infidelity and his crushing gambling debts. And she had walked away with nothing but an aging phone and a few changes of clothes, sitting alone that night at an unfamiliar bus station in a silent winter, while no one sat beside her, and no one asked if she was all right, and she had sworn she would never again allow anyone to see her weakness, Yet now she was the one opening the door for a stranger and accepting his shadowed gaze and his blurred answers about the past. And she washed her hands in warm water and studied her face in the staff restroom mirror, wondering what had changed. Perhaps age, perhaps the long years repeating themselves between tables and utility bills, had made her crave and act unmeasured and unguarded. And she dried her hands, released a quiet breath, and stepped outside with a freshly poured cup of coffee, intending to bring it to Jack before the afternoon shift began. Knowing well she was no hero, yet believing that sometimes doing what is right needs no clear reason, only loyalty to one's own heart in that moment. And this morning her heart had not yet told her to turn back. And at noon, Claire pushed open the storage room door again, carrying a paper bag with a sandwich and a cup of steaming chicken soup inside. Finding Jack awake now and leaning against the wall with his eyes fixed on the single high window, as if listening to the whine of the wind to measure time. And he turned when she entered, and gave a small nod in greeting as she set the bag down and took the chair across from him, with her arms folded, telling him he needed to explain what was truly happening in a voice not harsh yet firm. And Jack stayed silent for a moment, rotating the old paper cup in his hand before looking up with eyes sunken and still as frozen water, saying he had once worked for an organization she would not want to know by name, that those people were not like in the movies. They did not wear suits or drive luxury cars or laugh loudly in bars. They were quiet, intelligent, and more ruthless than anyone he had ever known, and Claire listened without interrupting, as he added that he had not killed anyone and needed to make that clear, that he handled the books for them, overseeing incoming and outgoing funds, transfer systems, and shell investments, because someone had to be the accountant for devils, and that one day he discovered they were using the identities of orphan children for money laundering, and he had stayed silent, believing himself no more than a small cog in a vast machine, until things grew worse. When one of the young errand workers was killed merely on suspicion of having spoken to the police, without proof, without mercy, only the elimination of risk, and Jack paused and swallowed as if the words still tasted bitter on his tongue, saying he could not endure it anymore, and began secretly copying data, recording every transaction, every name, every account, a process that took nearly a year before one day he vanished, and that if she wondered why he had ended up behind her diner the night before, it was because he had been running for nearly 2 weeks across 3 states, and that night he believed he could not take another step, and Claire studied him for a long time, her fingers tightening around the strap of her coat as she asked whether he still had the data. And Jack nodded as a flash of caution sharpened his gaze, saying he had hidden it well, but that they were drawing closer, and that he could not keep moving while bleeding and wounded. And Claire exhaled as if struggling to absorb the flood of information, asking what he intended to do now, and Jack met her eyes without evasion and said he would give it to the government, to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or anyone capable of destroying them, that he wanted no protection and nothing else, only that he did not wish to die as a coward who had stayed silent for too long. And a heavy quiet settled over the room, broken only by the faint clatter of metal as wind slipped beneath the old tin roof. And Claire rose with her hand resting on the door handle, then halted and asked one final question without turning back. If she helped him, would she be dragged into it? And Jack answered simply and without ornament that it was possible, and Claire gave the smallest nod as if only to herself, and stepped outside as the storage room door closed slowly behind her, separating them by a thin veil of cold air and countless unspoken consequences. Claire moved quickly toward the diner, the cold wind lashing her face until her cheeks went numb while her thoughts burned hot inside her head, and she slammed the back door shut behind her, leaning against the kitchen wall with her heart pounding as Jack's words echoed relentlessly in her mind, each detail slicing into the fragile trust she had only just begun to rebuild, part of her feeling betrayed as though she had unknowingly sheltered a criminal, while another part struggled to understand how she had arrived here. And she closed her eyes, drew a deep breath, and reached for the phone on the shelf by the sink, the emergency number already saved in quick memory. Only one tap away, one single call that would bring the police with their patrol cars, flashing lights, and handcuffs and end all of this. She would be safe again, released from danger, and the dark world Jack carried would be stopped at the threshold of her diner. Yet her hand did not press down. It hovered above the screen as her trembling thumb could not summon the strength to move, and she sank into a chair with her elbows on her knees and her head bowed, wondering why it had to be her, why that man had chosen this place at the very moment she was trying to live quietly and keep trouble far from her life, because she was no saint and no hero. All she had ever wanted was a peaceful existence, a job that paid the bills, and a place to return to without fear. Yet now everything felt threatened by a stranger stained with blood in his past, lying only a few steps away and holding a secret powerful enough to destroy them both if it reached the wrong hands. And Claire stood and paced the length of the kitchen like a caged animal, each footstep echoing in the empty space as though demanding to know what was truly right. And she thought of the former dishwasher who had vanished without a trace, of a regular customer's story about a younger brother pulled into drug dealing and later executed in an abandoned garage. Stories that had once felt distant and unreal, now living just beyond her own storage room wall, and she poured herself a glass of water, emptied it, then filled it again, her hands still shaking as she remembered the way Jack spoke of the child who was killed on suspicion alone, the way he confessed his long silence as its own unforgivable crime, and his eyes that did not beg or plead but only carried exhaustion and something like repentance, for he had not asked for forgiveness and had not asked to be saved, only for a chance to set something right. And Claire did not know whether she was being used, but if what he said was true, if that hidden data could truly bring down a criminal organization, then perhaps she should wait a little longer, not to trust him but to understand. And she looked at her phone again, darkened the screen, and slipped it into the drawer beneath the counter. Not now. Perhaps tonight, perhaps tomorrow, but not now. And she forced herself back to the plates, waiting for the lunch rush, knowing deep inside that the peace had already left this kitchen the moment she opened the storage room door the night before, and that now she could only move forward one step at a time, with her eyes wide and her heart restless. And night fell faster than usual as heavy clouds drifted low over the rooftops, swallowing both moonlight and the faint yellow glow of solitary windows. And after closing the diner, Claire carried a leftover meat pie and a bottle of warm water toward the storage room, unsure whether it was duty or something deeper guiding her. And when she opened the door, Jack was standing on a wooden chair with one hand holding the bulb and the other carefully tightening its loose base, and she paused for a few seconds watching his tall figure dissolve into the flickering light, until the sound of her steps made him turn with a faint smile. "The light was unstable last night," he said. "I thought I could fix it." And Claire set the food down and looked up at the ceiling and asked if he knew anything about electrical work. "A little," Jack replied calmly, as though being wounded and hunted were no longer weighing on him, and in that moment he seemed strangely ordinary, like a man simply trying to help in a place he did not dare to call home. And Claire stepped closer to steady the chair as he climbed down, and the bulb shone more evenly, its soft white light warming the room just a little, and she looked at him as if intending to speak but then fell silent. And Jack sat with his hands faintly trembling from the cold, though his eyes carried a glimmer of relief, as he said he was not very good at saying thank you, but he knew she had taken a risk. And Claire did not answer at once as she poured water into a plastic cup and slid it toward him, saying quietly that she still did not know whether she had done right or wrong and that she might change her mind tomorrow or call the police, but that tonight she was letting him stay, not because she trusted him but because she could not turn away. And Jack nodded without the slightest resistance, as if he fully understood he had no right to demand anything. And it was only a small gesture, the tightening of a light bulb, yet to Claire it was the first moment she felt Jack's presence was not merely a shadow lurking in fear. He was trying to help, however little, and in the world of those who have lost their faith, even a small act can quiet a storm within. And Claire warmed the leftover food from her bag, divided it in half, and offered one portion to Jack without smiling or shortening the distance between them, though her eyes had softened, and they ate in silence, with only the wind brushing against the tin wall outside, the scent of hot food spreading gently through the room, and for a fleeting moment, the small space felt not like a temporary hideout, but like a shelter for two lost souls, each carrying a separate past and searching for something that resembled peace, if only for one brief night in the cold of November. Dinner ended with the soft clink of a spoon against the side of a plastic container, and a silence that no longer felt as heavy as before, as Claire leaned back against the wooden wall of the storage shed, hands wrapped around a cup of warm tea, her gaze drifting up toward the light bulb that now shone more steadily than it had the night before, while Jack sat across from her with his legs stretched out, one arm cradling the wounded shoulder and the other holding a cup of cooling water. And neither of them spoke for several minutes, as if both were listening to the wind outside in search of a reason to remain where they were. Then Claire finally spoke in an even voice, as though telling a story that no longer bled yet would never truly fade, saying that she once hitchhiked across 6 states with only $30 in her pocket and a backpack with a torn strap, that she had been 23 then and had just been thrown out of her boyfriend's apartment after discovering he had been sleeping with her closest friend, and that from that moment on she kept moving, never staying anywhere too long, leaving no one who would remember her name once she was gone, and Jack did not interrupt but simply watched her with eyes as still as a quiet lake as she continued, saying she had slept on park benches, worked washing dishes without pay, smiled at customers while inside she only wanted to collapse and sleep, that once she nearly froze to death in an abandoned train station in Ohio, and that she did not cry even once because she was afraid that if she began she would never be able to stop, and her voice did not tremble, but her eyes carried the light of someone who had endured far more than youth should ever have to bear, and she turned to Jack and asked with reflexive curiosity what he had been before he became the man being hunted, and Jack pressed his lips together as his fingers unconsciously traced the rim of his cup, and said that he had once studied law at a good school on a full scholarship, and had wanted to become someone who helped those without a voice, but then his father died and his mother's debts piled up, and he discovered that the legal system he trusted could be bent if there was enough money involved, and an acquaintance invited him into the organization with the promise of freeing his mother from debt, and from there everything slid downhill, and Claire looked at him with a mix of surprise and understanding, and said that it seemed they had both once believed in something before it shattered, and Jack nodded as his gaze softened as if the invisible distance between them had receded by a single breath, and when he asked if she had ever told that story to anyone, she gave a faint smile and said there had been no one to tell, or no one patient enough to listen all the way through, that this was the first time she had ever said it in full, perhaps because he was like her in that one way of having no place to call home, and the small storage room grew warmer not only by the light but by a silence now colored by understanding, as Claire pulled the blanket up around her shoulders and leaned her head back with her eyes half closed and said that if she did not call the police the next day, then he owed her another story. And Jack smiled softly, a rare smile but strangely sincere, and said he would tell it if she did not drive him away first, and they sat there as two once lost souls sharing their nameless fragments, and on a cold Pittsburgh night for the first time, Claire felt that someone was truly listening to her, not out of curiosity but out of shared fatigue, and though it was late, neither of them felt sleepy, as Claire remained against the wooden wall with her hands folded in her lap, while Jack, after a long silence, leaned down and drew from beneath the blanket a small cloth bag, old and frayed at the corners, placing it on the table between them, and unzipping it to reveal a compact black hard drive that had clearly been carefully protected as the yellow light reflected faintly off its cold metal surface, and Claire looked at it without touching it, with eyes caught between caution and curiosity, as Jack said in a low and steady voice that this was what he had spent nearly a year assembling, that it contained company names, bank accounts, transfer routes, and even encrypted internal transactions, that he had done everything he could without being discovered, but they began to grow suspicious when they noticed changes in his routine, and he was forced to withdraw before they had reason to do something worse. And when Claire asked why he had not given it to the Federal Bureau of Investigation or the police before running, he gave a brief humorless smile and said that he had tried by mailing a partial copy to a federal legal office, and 3 days later that office was broken into. Nothing stolen, only a laptop destroyed, and several files erased with no sign of financial theft, and the police ruling it random vandalism, though he knew it was a warning, and a chill ran through Claire as she asked if he believed they had someone inside. And Jack nodded and said that if he handed this drive to the wrong person, he would not only die himself but also drag innocent people down with him, that he needed someone clever enough to extract the data, re-encrypt it safely, and send it to an address he had already prepared, someone not connected to him and not easily tracked. And Claire looked at him with a storm of danger and impulse churning in her mind, and asked why he was telling her this, and Jack lifted his eyes and met hers directly, and said it was because she was the only person so far who had not turned her back on him out of fear or self-interest, that she lived in obscurity with her small diner and a life no one watched, and that this very invisibility made her safe, that she could help him or not, and that he would not force her. And Claire remained silent for a long time, with her gaze fixed on the hard drive, as though it were a small bomb that might explode at any moment, knowing that if she agreed everything would spiral beyond her control, and might end the fragile peace she had fought to protect for so many years. Yet within her the voice of conscience grew clearer, not because she believed herself better than anyone else, but because she understood the feeling of being trapped in fear and silence, and if there was one thing in this life she could do that was truly right then, perhaps it lay before her now small, heavy, and cold within that metal shell. Claire lay awake the entire night, eyes fixed wide open on the ceiling as the glow from a street lamp outside filtered through the curtains and painted faint blurred streaks above her like a reminder that time waits for no one. And the next morning, while the city still drifted in a cold veil of mist, she was already seated at the kitchen table with her phone in hand, her thumb scrolling through an old contact list until it stopped on one name, Mason Adler. Nearly 7 years earlier, they had worked together in a small computer repair shop in Scranton when Claire had just left her drifting life behind and begun searching for steady work. Mason, a man of few words, obsessed with machines and nearly cut off from the world, yet a true genius in security and data recovery, someone she never thought she would contact again, but at this moment the only person she trusted to help without unnecessary questions. And she made the call, her heart pounding as the ring sounded the second time before Mason answered in the same hoarse and detached voice as always. And Claire greeted him and briefly explained that she needed help restoring and re-encrypting an important hard drive that could not be exposed under any circumstances. And after a few seconds of silence, Mason asked if she was personally involved in whatever this was. And Claire replied that she did not have time to explain and only needed him to trust her one more time, just as she had once trusted him when he said he could erase a bank account completely from the system of her former boyfriend. And Mason gave a quiet chuckle and agreed to meet her that afternoon at their old cafe on 5th Street. And Claire ended the call, took a deep breath, then turned to Jack, who was sitting at the table eating breakfast with a slice of cold toast, and told him she had found someone who could help, but that he must trust her and do absolutely nothing that might raise suspicion. And Jack nodded, his face still marked by fatigue, yet his eyes holding a fragile glimmer of hope. And that afternoon, Claire met Mason as arranged, finding him exactly as before with a thick coat worn at the shoulders, long curly hair brushing his neck and sharp eyes behind thin glasses. And when she gave him a general account without naming Jack or the organization, and only said that someone wanted to uncover suppressed evidence that could save many lives, Mason did not ask further questions. He took the hard drive, turned it lightly in his hand, and nodded, saying it was encrypted in 3 layers, and that an amateur would never open it, but that for him it would take 2 days at most 3, then asked where she wanted it sent. And Claire slid across the table a small piece of paper bearing the secure postal address Jack had prepared, and Mason looked at her, and this time his gaze was less cold as he asked if she was certain she wanted to be involved in this. And Claire answered that she was not, but that she was certain she could not remain still. And Mason nodded again, stood, and said he would call when it was done, and Claire left the cafe with heavy steps but a clearer direction in her heart, knowing that from now on each day would be a gamble, yet at least she had not turned away. And when she returned to the diner, Jack was wiping down the kitchen counter like a real employee, and Claire set her bag on the shelf and looked at him meaningfully as she said everything was beginning, and neither of them spoke another word, yet both understood that there was now no way back. And 3 days later, snow began to fall lightly over the drab gray rooftops of the Hill District, laying a thin coat across the brick steps and the damp walkway before Edna's diner, as Claire opened the door in the early morning, the lingering scent of bread and stale coffee in the air, giving her a false sense of normalcy, as though the world still moved along its proper rhythm with nothing smoldering beneath the surface. Yet that feeling did not last long, for around midday, when the diner was nearly empty, save for an elderly couple sharing sandwiches in the corner, the doorbell rang and a stranger stepped inside, and Claire glanced up and froze for a fraction of a second as he stood tall in a brown leather jacket with a baseball cap pulled low over his face, hiding most of his features but not the bearing of someone who did not belong to this neighborhood. And he moved slowly along the counter, his eyes sweeping the room as if measuring every wall and every exit, and Claire offered a polite smile and greeting, but he only nodded and took a seat at the bar in the very spot where Jack had once sat during his first days eating the leftover bread she quietly left for him, and she asked what she could get him while pouring a cup of coffee, and he shook his head and said he was only passing through and had stopped because the place looked quiet, yet his eyes did not rest as they continued to roam, sliding past the doors leading to the storage room and the stairs to the basement as if assessing possible cover, and he asked casually in a voice without local inflection how long the diner had been there, and Claire answered quickly, nearly 7 years since she returned to the city, and he smiled faintly and asked whether anyone new had been working there lately, or whether anyone had been staying behind the diner, and though the question sounded idle, Claire felt her chest tighten as she blinked, tilted her head as if searching her memory, and replied that there had been a temporary helper at the beginning of the month but that he had already left because the hours did not suit him, and she handed the coffee to the man with a steady grip, though a storm had begun to rise inside her, and he did not drink it but merely held the cup absent-mindedly before standing a short while later. And just before leaving, he turned back, his eyes cold as winter wind, and said that it really was quiet here, and that he hoped it would always remain that way. And Claire stood motionless, with her heart pounding as the bell rang again, and his silhouette vanished behind the fogged glass, and she immediately went straight to the storage room, where Jack was reviewing the small paper with the encryption code Mason had just sent remotely, and Claire entered and closed the door behind her, her voice low as wind slipping through a crack as she said that someone had come looking. And Jack looked up, his eyes sharpening as he asked what the man had wanted, and Claire answered that he had asked about him, about anyone staying behind the diner, and had looked at the storage room as if he knew something was hidden there. And Jack clenched his fist until the knuckles whitened as he said that they now knew he was still alive, and Claire felt her heart contract as she replied that this meant now it was no longer only one person who was being hunted. And she left the storage room and went back to the counter, grabbing the back door key and locking it tight while outside the snow continued to fall softly, yet within her a storm had begun to take shape, signaling that whatever peace had once existed was no longer a place of shelter. That evening Claire stayed behind to clean the diner alone, forcing every movement to appear ordinary even as each step felt like walking across fragile ice, Jack having been firmly instructed not to leave the storage room, while Claire locked every entrance and exit, and even wedged an iron bar behind the back door, the easiest point of intrusion. And when the wall clock struck 10, she began turning off the lights, section by section, and carrying the trash out to the bin in the alley behind the diner, the cold wind slashing her cheeks like a thin blade, and the alley darker than usual because the rear light had shattered earlier that afternoon. And just as she set the trash bag down, the sensation of being watched raised the hair along her spine, and a soft footstep sounded behind her, and before she could turn a powerful hand seized her arm and yanked her into the shadows. Claire gasped and tried to scream, but another hand clamped tightly over her mouth as the man's eyes became clear in the dim light, the same stranger from the morning now stripped of his polite customer's mask, and his voice hissed cold through his teeth like steel, as he warned her that keeping her mouth shut would be good for everyone, as he slammed her against the wall and gripped the collar of her coat, demanding to know where that bastard was, and sneering that she really thought they were stupid enough not to trace the scent of blood at the storage door. And Claire struggled wildly, her foot kicking into his lower body, but he was stronger and held her fast, telling her he did not want to kill her, but if she kept doing foolish things, she would become the first warning to let him know that no one could save him. And he drew a small knife, that was not polished yet, whose blade was cold and sharp enough to numb her flesh with terror. But in that instant her survival instinct surged, and Claire suddenly twisted sideways and slammed her head hard into his chin, the man staggering as his grip loosened, and she shoved him away with all her strength and spun toward the back door of the diner, snatching up a cast-iron pan and turning to face him, ready if he came again. But he did not pursue her, and she heard his footsteps retreating in fast disorder down the alley and dissolving into darkness, her entire body trembling as she still clutched the pan, and her breath came in ragged bursts, like someone surfacing from deep water, and she slammed the door shut and locked it with every bolt before leaning against the cold metal as her mind reeled, for fear was no longer a vague shadow of imagination. Now it had a form, the stale scent of old cigarettes, and a blade brushing the skin of her throat. And Claire ran to the storage room where Jack was sitting asleep beside the small table, and his eyes flew open at the sight of her shaken face. And when he asked what had happened, she dropped into a chair, gasping, and looked straight at him, and told him they had truly come now, and that next time she might not be fast enough to push the man away, and no further words were needed, because in Jack's eyes she saw that from this moment every remaining boundary had vanished, and they had no time left. And the next morning, when the pale early winter sunlight had not yet grown warm enough to dispel the cold of the night, her phone vibrated with a message from Mason displaying the 4 words she had been waiting for: "It is done. Meet me." And her heart raced, not only because the data had been successfully decrypted, but because it marked the moment of no return, and she replied with their usual meeting place, then quietly set the phone down and stepped out of the storage room where Jack still sat wrapped in his old coat. And upon hearing the news he said nothing, only nodded and began carefully gathering the remaining papers as if every movement might release a living secret. And Claire met Mason at noon at the old cafe tucked deep inside the neighborhood where they had once worked, and he was already seated in a shadowed corner, with a black taped USB drive and an envelope of detailed documents before him, and he asked no questions but slid them toward her, and spoke softly that she must deliver these directly, not through the mail and not through any intermediary, and that they must reach the right hands without fail. And Claire nodded in thanks, and left the cafe hiding the USB inside the lining of her coat, with her hand clenched tight, as if the life of many rested within it. And that evening she and Jack sat across from one another in the storage room, with a city map spread wide between them, as Jack pointed to a location near the airport, housing a federal office specializing in financial crimes and money laundering investigations, and said it was the only place capable of securing the data and opening an inquiry without leakage, though access would require a legitimate reason. And after a moment, Claire remembered her late mother's old friend Harriet, who had once worked as an accountant for a large insurance company and was now a temporary assistant in that very office, and that if she could ask Harriet to escort her inside under the pretense of delivering urgent audit materials, everything might proceed more smoothly. And Jack looked at her with a mixture of hope and dread, and asked if she was certain, because if she were exposed they would no longer be hunting only him. And Claire replied that she had already faced a knife at her throat, and that she could no longer go back to warming pastries and pretending her life was safe, and that they had no other choice. And they finalized the plan, with Claire delivering the USB and documents directly, while Jack observed from a distance in case they were being followed, all data having been re-encrypted by Mason to be fully unlocked only by the proper authorities. And with no time left for hesitation, Claire checked the clock, then met Jack's eyes. Two people pushed into the heart of a storm by fate yet unwilling to bend. And tomorrow everything would be decided. And regardless of the outcome, she knew she would no longer be the woman who wiped tables in a small diner in a quiet city, for she had stepped into a far larger story and was no longer afraid to see it through to the end. When Claire finally drifted into sleep after a long night spent planning and preparing every step for the day ahead, Jack remained seated in silence in the corner of the storage room. Before him, a blank sheet of paper and an old fountain pen he had found in the drawer beneath the spice cabinet, the weak light above the table casting his first trembling lines of ink. Not because his hands were cold, but because his heart was quietly bracing itself for an ending he knew might be the only way she could remain safe, and he began to write slowly, each line pouring straight from the depths of his chest, where remorse, fear, and the longing for redemption had long been tightly bound. My name is Jack Leland. I once worked for a criminal organization operating covertly across multiple states and involved in money laundering, asset smuggling, and the intimidation of witnesses. I managed financial data and concealed transactions, and during that time I secretly backed up evidence because I could no longer continue to turn a blind eye to the acts in which I was complicit. Everything I retained is contained on the encrypted hard drive now being prepared for delivery to a federal agency. The woman named Claire Whitman is in no way connected to any part of my past activities. She is simply the first person who chose to see me as a human being and did not turn away when I needed help. If anyone must be held accountable, it should be me and me alone. I am prepared to surrender if doing so will protect her from any danger or legal consequence. I write this letter in full awareness and of my own free will. And Jack paused, then lifted his gaze to look around the small storage room into which he had entered weeks earlier, like a trembling ghost in the darkness, and from which he was now preparing to step out as a man willing to face the consequences. And he folded the letter carefully, placed it into an envelope, and slipped it into the lowest drawer of the kitchen cabinet, where Claire usually kept cleaning cloths and where few would ever think to look, not intending to tell her. At least not now, because he knew if she found out she would not allow it, and would say they were a team, that everything had gone too far for him to turn back alone. Yet Jack understood better than anyone that in this game loyalty does not always mean surviving together, and that sometimes one must make a sacrifice not because one has lost, but because one wants someone else to win. And he looked over at Claire sleeping, curled beneath a thin blanket, her face holding a rare peace amid days weighed down by worry, and he wanted to preserve that image, to carve it deep into memory, so that if one day he had to leave, he would carry no regret, only a small measure of the light she had quietly brought into his life. And he sat there a while longer, his eyes never leaving her before standing, switching off the light and stepping softly toward the small rear window, where the late-night Pittsburgh sky remained cold and gray. Yet within him, one truth had across. He never been clearer that if this must end, he wanted it to be so, that she could begin again. And that morning the Pittsburgh sky lay thick and gray like an unspoken farewell, as Claire and Jack left the storage room before dawn while the streets still slept, the windows drowsy and the streetlights not yet fully extinguished, and they spoke nothing along the way, hearing only the soft echo of their own footsteps on the frozen pavement, as Claire clutched her handbag tightly inside it, the USB containing the carefully encrypted data along with a sealed letter Jack had hidden in the cabinet, and which she had discovered by chance at first light only hours after he wrote it, and she had read it in absolute silence, each line cutting like a blade through the fragile calm they had only just begun to build. Yet she did not tell Jack that she knew, and did not ask why he had chosen to sacrifice himself, because in his eyes now she already saw the answer, and their meeting point was an empty parking lot behind an abandoned warehouse near the outskirts, where a black vehicle bearing a government plate waited motionless as though it had been there since the night before, and two agents in long coats stepped out without giving names, offering only a brief nod when Claire raised her hand. one of them taking the bag from her, inspecting it carefully, then nodding in confirmation. And Jack looked at her, his expression softening for a moment before turning to the agents and saying with strange calm that there was no need for handcuffs because he knew exactly what he was doing. And one of the agents gave a slight shrug, opened the car door and motioned for him to enter, and Claire stood a few steps away, her hands clenched tightly in the pockets of her coat, saying nothing, only watching Jack as if trying to hold that image for as long as she could. And Jack paused before getting into the car, turned back and looked at her one last time, that gaze holding neither regret nor fear, but something as light as wind and as deep as winter, the kind of emotion that appears only when a man knows he has finally found the last true thing in his life. And he did not say goodbye, and Claire did not call after him because they both understood words were no longer necessary. And the car door closed, the engine roared, tearing through the shroud of stillness, as the vehicle slowly pulled away, turned at the intersection and vanished behind the line of weathered buildings, and Claire stood there a long time, until the exhaust faded from the air, and his silhouette remained only in memory, and she did not cry, for her tears seemed to have dried up long ago through earlier partings in her life. Yet her chest ached as though something had been torn from the deepest place in her heart, and in that moment she understood that there are farewells that need no sob, no embrace, yet leave an echo that never fades. And then, as if carried by the wind, she turned and walked in the opposite direction, her steps unhurried yet steady, each one not only carrying her away from that man, but also forward into a new chapter where she was no longer a witness or a bystander, but one who had chosen, who had stepped forward, and who had preserved her humanity within a world overrun by shadow. Winter passed slowly, like successive waves of cold wind sweeping through the damp streets of the Hill District, leaving thin layers of frost on window panes and in the hearts of those who lived there. And Edna's diner still opened its doors every morning like an old clock that never stopped ticking, with the same worn bar stools, the familiar scent of baked bread mingling with weak black coffee, and the bright jingle of the doorbell whenever a customer stepped inside. And Claire was still there, wiping the counter, serving breakfast to old Mr. Malcolm with his habitual order of 2 soft-boiled eggs and a slice of toast burned at the edges, nodding in greeting to the elderly couple at the end of the block who always asked for unsweetened coffee but requested 2 packets of creamer. And everything seemed unchanged, as if the upheaval of a few weeks earlier had been nothing more than a faded dream. Yet Claire knew with certainty that something was no longer the same. For in the rare pauses between customers, she would often stand behind the counter looking out at the street through the misted glass, her gaze quiet as though waiting for something she herself could not name. And every evening when she closed the diner and carefully latched each lock, she would linger a few minutes in the storage room that had once sheltered a man who carried so much darkness, and yet possessed eyes that knew how to see the light. And she never asked about the outcome of the investigation, and never once tried to learn what had become of Jack after the day he stepped into the government-plated car, partly because she did not know what she could do with such knowledge, and partly because she understood that some truths are best kept as silent cuts within the heart, so they do not reopen wounds that have barely begun to heal. And once on a quiet evening, Mason stopped by, sat at the counter, and silently sipped the coffee Claire poured for him, saying very little, and merely nodding when he caught the question in her eyes. Everything was handled properly, he said, and left before she could ask more, and Claire knew that was all she needed to know. And on long nights when the city slept beneath thick blankets of snow, Claire lay on the narrow bed in the small rented room behind the diner, her hand holding the old fountain pen Jack had left behind, her mind tracing back to the faint smile he wore that night under the dim storage room light, a memory she never spoke of but kept safely tucked away in a drawer as a private memory not meant for the world's gaze. And sometimes she wondered if things might have been different had Jack not gone that day, if time might have altered their course. Yet she always reminded herself that it was precisely his choice that had given her a life of quiet safety, and that sometimes quiet is all a person can hope for after great upheaval. And Claire's life went on like a small river, gentle yet never empty, and in her looks and in each silent gesture as she folded napkins or refilled cups, there bloomed something deeper than before, not sorrow or regret but compassion, gratitude, and above all the quiet growth of a soul that had passed through storm. And Claire was no longer merely the girl who wiped tables and avoided trouble. She was now a woman who carried a secret, a story, and an invisible scar that would forever remind her that there are moments in life, however brief, that can change a person irrevocably. And then one autumn morning, when the sky was strangely clear after many days of relentless rain, Claire opened the doors of Edna's diner as she always did, and swept the steps covered in red-brown maple leaves with the sense that time itself had begun to move more lightly unhurried as it had felt in earlier months, and the diner was unchanged with the faint scent of cinnamon pastries in the air, and the low murmur of the radio carrying the familiar, warm voice of the local broadcaster, while Claire stayed busy serving her regulars through the morning until the doorbell rang once more, and this time it was not a customer but old Henry the mail carrier, who stopped by every Friday, and he placed a small envelope on the counter, smiled, and left at once with nothing more than a wish for her to have a good day. And Claire looked at the envelope, which bore no return name, only a postmark from a small town in the western part of the country she had never visited, the paper slightly yellowed, and the slanted handwriting achingly familiar, so that at a single glance her heart faltered, and inside was a simple postcard showing a small roadside diner set in open countryside, with a hill of tall grass rising behind it. And on the image there was only one line written in black ink, slanted like the path of wind itself: "The soup's still warm." And Claire stood motionless with her hand faintly trembling, not from cold but from the sudden return of something she believed had long been closed, and she read the words again, pressing her lips together to contain what surged within her. For it was not an ordinary message, but the very sentence she had once spoken on a bitter night, when that man stood shivering in a dark alley like a lost shadow, and she had opened the door, looked into his eyes, and whispered, "Come in, the soup is still warm." And now, after so many seasons, that sentence returned like a revived heartbeat, and there was no address and no promise of meeting. Yet she understood. He was alive, and somewhere he still remembered every word she had spoken. And Claire folded the postcard and placed it carefully inside the small notebook she always carried with her, then returned to her work with a faint smile at the corner of her mouth, as the emptiness she once believed had taken permanent. The residence in her heart grew suddenly lighter like a thin veil of mist dispersed by sunlight, and perhaps he would never return, and perhaps life had taken another path. But the simple truth that he remembered and had sent her one quiet sign was enough to soothe the long months of silent waiting and the endless lonely nights. And in a small hidden corner of her heart, Claire knew that if one day he ever did return, whether in silence or with weary steps, the door of this little diner would still open, and the pot of soup on the stove would still be warm, like a promise that could never be forgotten. That evening, after finishing her usual routine of cleaning the diner and double-checking every lock as she always did, Claire slipped on her thick coat, the shoulders worn soft with time, and quietly stepped outside into the softened Pittsburgh air, where a gentle wind carried the scent of damp wood and dry leaves scattered across the pavement, and the pale yellow streetlights cast her shadow long across the ground, like a silent strand of memory. As she stood on the steps of Edna's diner and looked out toward the distance where the city's lights blurred into mist, her heart quiet now, no longer heavy, the postcard still warm in her pocket like a steady breath within the cold night. And it seemed that life had chosen for her an ending not perfect but quietly whole in its own way. For perhaps Jack would never return, and perhaps all that remained would be a distant farewell. Yet more important than anything else was that trust still endured, that human kindness still endured, and that the power of a single compassionate act could change not only one destiny but two lives at once. And when you choose to help another for no reason beyond mercy itself, sometimes you are planting the seed of a miracle you never expected. And Claire had not chosen absolute safety. She had chosen to believe in a human being, even one bearing the heavy scars of a painful past. And in return she received a reply not dazzling but sincere, like a low, lingering note at the final measure of a life's quiet music. And this story may be only a small fragment among countless real stories in the world. Yet if you have ever met someone who forced you to choose between fear and trust, between silence and action, perhaps you will understand why moments that seem so small can become the turning point of an entire life. And how do you feel about this story? Does it remind you of someone in your own life? Have you ever had to choose between safety and conscience? We invite you to share with us in the comments below, because we truly wish to hear the honest emotions from the depths of your heart. And if this story has touched you, please press like, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with those you believe may also feel its meaning, for we will continue to bring you moving and meaningful stories each day, so that we may walk with you through every emotion of life. And thank you for listening and for accompanying us to the very end of this story. We wish you enduring health, a life each day filled with wholeness, peace, and warmth beside those you love. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.